But then I got really good at it. And I think, especially with something like The Passion that I did, the written word was very important because it was, you got all those books, the Bible, you've got the different Gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar with.
Hollywood called him dangerous. The media called him finished. His own colleagues tried to bury him. But Mel Gibson, the man behind the most controversial religious film ever made, never stopped believing that physical evidence for the Bible was out there, waiting to be found. And in the high desert of Oregon, archaeologists and geologists have been uncovering something that has shaken assumptions about ancient history, global flooding, and the origins of human civilization. This is the story of a man who bet his entire career on faith and the discoveries beneath American soil that are making his critics go quiet. The man Hollywood tried to cancel before canceling existed. To understand why Mel Gibson's connection to biblical discovery matters, you first have to understand that Gibson is not a casual believer. He is not a celebrity who puts faith in his Instagram bio and shows up at church on Christmas. He is a man who risked and partially lost one of the most successful careers in Hollywood history because of what he believed, and who kept believing it anyway. Mel Columcille Gerard Gibson was born on January 3, 1956, in Peekskill, New York. The sixth of 11 children born to Hutton Gibson and Anne Patricia Riley Gibson. The family was Catholic, not mainstream American Catholic, but traditional Latin Mass Catholic, from a branch of the faith that rejected the reforms of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. For the Gibsons, the changes to the Mass introduced in Vatican II were not an evolution of the faith, but a corruption of it. This was not a fringe position within certain Catholic circles, but it was a position that put the family at odds with most of institutional Catholicism. Hutton Gibson, Mel's father, was a dominant presence in his son's life, and a man whose influence on Mel's worldview cannot be overstated. Hutton was an autodidact, a voracious reader who had strong and unconventional opinions on almost everything, including history, religion, and politics. He was also, by the time his views became publicly known, someone whose historical opinions caused real controversy. Hutton Gibson denied the scale of the Holocaust, made statements about Jewish control of media and finance, and held a range of views that placed him well outside mainstream discourse. Mel Gibson has spent years trying to disentangle his own beliefs from his father's most extreme positions, with mixed success in the court of public opinion. He has not, by most accounts, shared his father's Holocaust denial. But the traditional Catholic worldview he absorbed from Hutton, the belief in absolute biblical truth, the suspicion of mainstream institutions, and the conviction that the modern world had abandoned something essential stayed with him completely. In 2004, Gibson spent $30 million of his own money to make The Passion of the Christ, a film depicting the final 12 hours of Jesus' life, filmed in Aramaic and Latin with no major studio backing because every studio in Hollywood had turned it down. They turned it down partly for commercial reasons, and partly because the project was seen as likely to generate controversy over its portrayal of Jewish leaders in the crucifixion narrative. They were right that it would generate controversy. They were catastrophically wrong about the commercial calculation. The Passion of the Christ grossed over $600 million worldwide on a $30 million budget, becoming one of the most profitable films in cinema history relative to its production cost. Gibson had proven, in the most direct way possible, that Hollywood's gatekeepers did not understand the appetite of religious audiences. The film earned him enemies in the industry that he has never fully shaken. Accusations of anti-Semitism followed it. Critics argued that the film's portrayal of Jewish crowds calling for Jesus' death was inflammatory. Gibson defended the film as historically faithful to the Gospels and refused to make the edits that critics demanded. What The Passion established, beyond the box office numbers, was that Gibson was a man who would spend his own money and risk his own reputation to put his faith on screen, and that he would not be told by Hollywood what his faith was allowed to look like. That stubbornness, that willingness to go to the wall for what he believed, is the same quality that makes his interest in biblical archaeology and ancient evidence significant. When Gibson says he finds something compelling, it is not a brand endorsement. It is a statement from a man who has demonstrated, at considerable personal cost, that he means what he says about what he believes. The controversies that nearly buried him. If Part 1 is the story of a man who risked his career for his faith, Part 2 is the story of what happened when everything else in his life caught up with him. Because Mel Gibson, whatever his virtues as a filmmaker and believer, is also a man who has made serious, documented public mistakes, and those mistakes cannot be separated from who he is or from how his ideas about faith and history have been received. The night of July 28, 2006, changed everything. Gibson was pulled over by a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy on Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. His blood alcohol level was 0.12 above the legal limit of 0.08. What happened next was captured in the arresting officer's report, which was leaked to the celebrity news site TMZ and published in full. According to the report, Gibson launched into an anti-Semitic tirade blaming Jewish people for all the wars in the world, making threatening and derogatory comments, and behaving in a manner that the arresting officer described as aggressive and profane. The report went everywhere within hours. The response from the entertainment industry was swift and largely final. Gibson was radioactive. Studios that had been willing to work with him after the Passion controversy, who had, many of them, quietly admired the film's commercial success even while publicly distancing themselves from its politics, now refused to associate with him. Producing partner Alan Ladd Jr. cut ties. WME dropped him as a client. The director, who had been one of the most commercially successful in Hollywood, was, within a matter of weeks, effectively shut out of the system he had conquered. Gibson issued a public apology that was widely criticized as inadequate. He said he was an alcoholic and that his statements did not reflect his real beliefs. Skeptics pointed out that drunk words were often sober thoughts, and that the specific content of his tirade fit a pattern of his father's views, the Passion controversy, years of allegations that couldn't be dismissed as a single aberration. He disappeared from public life for several years. When he re-emerged, it was into a second controversy. In 2010, audio recordings were released of Gibson in phone conversations with his then-girlfriend, Oksana Grigorieva, the Russian musician and mother of his daughter Lucia. The recordings were disturbing. Gibson was heard screaming, using racial slurs, and making threats. Grigorieva accused him of physical violence. Gibson denied the violence charge. A criminal investigation found insufficient evidence to prosecute but did not exonerate him completely. The recordings, regardless of their legal outcome, were damaging in ways that went beyond the 2006 DUI. His relationship with Hollywood through this period was adversarial in both directions. Gibson felt he was being treated more harshly than other celebrities whose behavior was comparable or worse. Some colleagues agreed with him quietly and said so publicly. Others maintained that the combination of the 2006 statements and the 2010 recordings represented a pattern that went beyond ordinary bad behavior. He spent the decade rebuilding, slowly. Hacksaw Ridge in 2016, the Desmond Doss film, earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Director, and reminded the industry of what he was capable of when the cameras were rolling. But the rebuilding was always partial. The enemies he had made were not inclined to forget, and Gibson, for his part, had not stopped being the man who had made them. This is the context in which his statements about faith, biblical history and ancient discovery exist. The words of a man who has been written off, who believes he has been targeted by the institutions he has challenged, and who has had enough experience of being dismissed to have developed a fairly comprehensive disdain for the dismissers. What was found in Oregon, the real discoveries. Now, to the ground literally. Because whatever one thinks of Mel Gibson, the discoveries being made in Oregon are real, documented, and significant enough that they have forced revisions to mainstream scientific timelines and reopened debates about ancient human history that researchers thought were settled. The most important of these is the Paisley Caves discovery. The Paisley Caves are a series of volcanic rock shelters in Lake County, in the high desert of south-central Oregon, near the town of Paisley. They are not dramatic-looking, shallow openings in a dry hillside, easy to overlook. But in the mid-2000s, archaeologist Dennis Jenkins of the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History led excavations there that produced results that shook the field. His team found coprolites, fossilized human feces, deep in the sediment layers of the caves. They extracted ancient human DNA from those coprolites. The DNA was unambiguously human, and when it was carbon dated, the results came back at approximately 14,300 years ago, making the Paisley Caves humans the oldest genetically confirmed human presence in the Americas. This was published in Science magazine in 2008, one of the most respected peer-reviewed journals in the world. It was not a fringe claim. It was peer-reviewed, independently replicated, and broadly accepted by the mainstream archaeological community. What it meant was significant. Humans were in Oregon in the interior of North America, far from any coastal entry point, at least 14,300 years ago, predating the previously accepted Clovis culture by more than 1,000 years. The question of how they got there and where they came from reopened debates that had seemed closed. The genetic profile of the Paisley Caves humans showed haplogroup markers and genetic signatures that connected them to populations in Siberia and Central Asia, consistent with migration across the Bering Land Bridge or by coastal boat. But the timing and the location raised questions. If people were in the interior of Oregon 14,300 years ago, they had been in the Americas for longer than the standard model suggested. And they had traveled further from the entry points faster than previously thought. For biblical literalists, and for researchers who work within a framework that takes ancient religious texts seriously as a historical documents, the Paisley Caves discovery opened a different set of questions. Ancient migration narratives, the dispersal of peoples after events like the Tower of Babel in Genesis, have specific timelines that mainstream archaeology had long dismissed. The Paisley Caves evidence, combined with other pre-Clovis discoveries, pushed the human presence in the Americas back into a window that intersects more closely with some of these ancient narrative timelines. The second major Oregon discovery relevant to this story is geological rather than archaeological, and it is, if anything, more directly connected to biblical narratives. Oregon and the broader Pacific Northwest sit at the end of one of the most dramatic flood events in geological history, the Missoula floods. Between approximately 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, a series of catastrophic floods swept through the Pacific Northwest with a force and scale that geologists describe as among the largest flood events in Earth's known history. The source was Glacial Lake Missoula, in what is now Montana, a body of water held back by an ice dam that repeatedly formed and broke, each time releasing a wall of water that swept westward through Idaho and Oregon, down the Columbia River Gorge, and into the Pacific. The volume of water released in the largest of these events has been estimated at roughly 500 cubic miles, moving at speeds up to 65 miles per hour, reaching depths of hundreds of feet in some valleys. The evidence is still visible in the landscape of eastern Oregon and Washington today. The channeled scablands, the giant ripple marks in Montana visible from the air, the massive erratic boulders carried hundreds of miles by the floodwaters and deposited randomly across the landscape. Geologist J. Harlan Bretz identified the evidence for these catastrophic floods as early as the 1920s and spent decades being dismissed by the mainstream geological community, which, at the time, was committed to the principle of uniformitarianism and deeply resistant to the idea of catastrophic flooding on this scale. He was eventually vindicated completely and received the Penrose Medal, geology's highest honor, in 1979, largely for this work. The Missoula floods are not a conspiracy theory or a fringe claim. They are established mainstream geology, and they are precisely the kind of catastrophic, landscape-altering, life-ending flood event that the biblical account of Noah describes not in the Pacific Northwest specifically, but as a global phenomenon of which regional events may be evidence. The biblical connection. Do the Oregon discoveries support the biblical narrative? It is a question that mainstream science answers one way, that biblical literalists answer another, and that a growing number of researchers in the middle answer with a more complicated, "it depends on what you mean." Start with the flood. The biblical account of Noah's flood in Genesis describes a global catastrophic flood that reset human civilization and from which a single family survived to repopulate the earth. Mainstream geology does not support a single global flood event in human history. What it does support is a series of massive regional flood events, including the Missoula floods in the Pacific Northwest that were catastrophic at a regional scale and that occurred within the time frame of human habitation. Flood narratives exist in virtually every ancient human culture on every continent. The Mesopotamian flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh predates the biblical account and shares remarkable structural similarities with it. Flood myths appear in ancient Chinese texts, in Native American oral traditions, in Hindu scripture, and in Greek mythology. The near universality of these narratives is a documented phenomenon that mainstream anthropology acknowledges without consensus on what it means. One explanation is that the narratives are independently invented, and that flooding is common enough worldwide that every culture generates a flood story. Another explanation, advanced by researchers including geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in their 1997 book Noah's Flood, is that the stories reflect a real event, specifically the catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea Basin approximately 7,500 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters broke through the Bosphorus and inundated a large inhabited lowland area. Ryan and Pittman argued that survivors of this event, spreading outward in multiple directions, carried their flood memory into the oral traditions of multiple cultures. Neither explanation fully accounts for the specific consistency of the narratives across cultures that had no documented contact with each other. The Missoula floods add a Pacific Northwest data point to this global picture. The indigenous peoples of the Columbia Plateau, the ancestors of the Nez Perce, the Cayuse, and the Umatilla, have oral traditions describing massive floods that swept through their ancestral lands. These traditions predate European contact and predate any possibility of biblical influence. They describe water at heights and with force consistent with what the geological record shows the Missoula floods produced. This is not proof of a global biblical flood. It is evidence that catastrophic flooding events of enormous scale occurred in multiple regions during the period of human habitation, and that human memory of those events persisted in oral tradition across millennia. For someone like Mel Gibson, a man whose faith is rooted in the literal truth of Scripture, and who has spent his career arguing that mainstream culture systematically dismisses evidence that challenges its preferred narrative, these convergences are not a coincidence, they are confirmation. The flood happened, The Bible describes it. The rocks remember it. The Paisley Caves discovery connects to a different part of the biblical narrative, the dispersal of peoples. Genesis 10 and 11 describe the spread of Noah's descendants across the earth after the flood, the Table of Nations, and the Tower of Babel narrative in which a unified humanity is dispersed into separate peoples. Biblical chronologists have long argued about the timeline of this dispersal. The genetic evidence from the Paisley Caves, combined with other ancient DNA studies of pre-Clovis Americans, shows a picture of human migration that is rapid, wide-ranging, and earlier than the standard model predicted. Populations moved from Central Asia to the interior of Oregon in timeframes that suggest either coastal migration routes that are now underwater, or overland routes that were more passable during the last ice age than previously modeled. The timing of these migrations in the window between roughly 16,000 and 13,000 years ago overlaps with the period that some biblical scholars, using genealogical calculations from Genesis, place the post-flood dispersal of peoples. This does not prove the connection, but it places the two narratives, the scientific and the scriptural, in closer temporal proximity than mainstream archaeology had previously allowed. Gibson, the sequel, and why this story isn't over. In 2023, Mel Gibson confirmed what had been rumored for years. He was working on a sequel to The Passion of the Christ, tentatively titled The Resurrection of the Christ. Jim Caviezel, who had played Jesus in the original film, was confirmed to return. Gibson described the project as the film he had been building toward since the original, a portrayal of the resurrection that he believed would be, in his words, the biggest film in history. The announcement was met with the same mix of anticipation from religious audiences and skepticism from Hollywood that had greeted the original. The same institutional resistance was visible. The same cultural machinery that had dismissed The Passion before it broke every commercial expectation was preparing to dismiss the sequel. Gibson, for his part, showed every sign of not caring. He had been through enough. The DUI, the Oksana recordings, the years of being shut out of the industry, the slow rebuilding through Hacksaw Ridge and other projects, to have arrived at a position beyond caring what the mainstream thought of him. He had been dismissed before. He had made The Passion anyway. The film had spoken for itself. His sustained engagement with biblical history and archaeological evidence is not incidental to his filmmaking. It is the foundation of it. Gibson has spoken in interviews over the years about his belief that the events described in the Gospels are literally, historically true, not metaphorically true, not spiritually meaningful, but factually questionable, but actually physically true in the same sense that the Battle of Waterloo is true. He approaches the material not as a filmmaker adapting a religious text, but as someone who believes he is dramatizing real events. This is what connects him, thematically if not always directly, to the kind of discoveries being made in Oregon and elsewhere. The Paisley Caves, the Missoula floods, the convergence of flood narratives across unconnected ancient cultures, these are data points in a larger argument that Gibson, in his specific way, has been making with his career for 30 years. The argument is, the ancient texts are not mythology, they are history, and the Earth, if you look at it carefully enough, will tell you so. What the Oregon discoveries represent in this framework is a piece of physical evidence that the biblical narrative of catastrophic global events and the rapid dispersal of ancient peoples is not a fantastic invention, but the preserved memory of things that actually happened. The floods were real. The migrations were real. The timeline, when you lay the geological and genetic evidence alongside the scriptural chronology, is closer than mainstream science has typically been willing to acknowledge. The debate between mainstream science and biblical archaeology is old, sometimes heated, and unlikely to be resolved by any single discovery. Mainstream archaeologists and geologists whose work on the Paisley Caves and the Missoula floods is entirely solid by the standards of their disciplines do not, in general, draw the biblical connections that this script has explored. They would push back correctly on any claim that these discoveries prove the Bible in the way that a YouTube title implies. What they do, more modestly and more accurately, is this: they narrow the gap. They push the human story in the Americas back further than the standard model allowed. They confirmed the reality of catastrophic regional flooding at a scale and in a time frame consistent with the preservation of flood memory in ancient oral traditions. They demonstrate that ancient migration happened faster and further than previously accepted, which is consistent with the dispersal narratives in Genesis. For a man like Mel Gibson, who has staked his reputation, his money, and a significant portion of his career on the literal truth of the biblical narrative, these are not small things. They are vindication. Not complete, not scientific proof in the narrow sense, but confirmation that the people who told him he was a fool for believing were not as certain as they pretended to be. Gibson is now in his late 60s. He has survived the wreckage of his public image and come out the other side still making films, still talking about his faith, still funding projects that Hollywood would not touch without him. He is also, by every account, a man who reads widely on ancient history, biblical archaeology, and the physical evidence for events described in Scripture. Whether he will live to see the discoveries in Oregon and elsewhere fully integrated into the conversation about ancient human history remains to be seen. Whether those discoveries will ever satisfy the mainstream demand for a specific kind of proof is a separate question. But the ground is shifting. The caves in Oregon have yielded evidence that was not supposed to be there. The geology of the Pacific Northwest records a flood of biblical proportions. The ancient peoples of the Columbia Plateau remembered something in their oral traditions that the rocks confirm. The Earth, as it turns out, has been keeping records, and some of what it has kept looks very much like the oldest story in the world. Hollywood wrote Mel Gibson off twice. The science establishment dismissed the Oregon discoveries for decades. Both were wrong. Sometimes the people everyone calls crazy are just the ones paying attention. If this made you think twice about what's buried beneath the surface, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you will never miss the latest updates.